Bien, damos inicio al programa de expositores. En primer lugar, nos va a acompañar el señor Paul Sobel. Él es vicepresidente, jefe en auditores ejecutivos de Georgia Pacific, con sede en Atlanta, Estados Unidos. Past Chairman of the Board en los años 2013-2014 por el Instituto Internacional de Auditores Global Estados Unidos. En el año 2012, Paul fue reconocido por la revista Treasury and Risk en la lista de las 100 personas más influyentes en finanzas. Cuenta con las certificaciones CIA, QIAL, CRMA, licenciatura en Ciencias en Administración de Empresas por la Washington University in St. Louis All in Business School, siendo un experto en temas de gobierno, ERM, cumplimiento y control interno, así como un reconocido conferencista internacional. El título de su exposición es Misión Posible: cómo la auditoría interna puede mejorar y proteger el valor organizacional. Lo recibimos con un fuerte aplauso, por favor.
Buenos días, but no habla español. So unfortunately, I will now be switching over to speak in English. Hopefully, those who need it have their translation devices handy. Gracias. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Institute on 35 years of success. That's a wonderful accomplishment, and really some very impressive things that have been done in the last couple of years and that you will continue to do. I know that there are members of this institute who are involved at a global level, and that's very much recognized and appreciated. So again, congratulations on a job well done. Now, my presentation is going to be a little bit different today. It's not talking about necessarily some of the traditional topics that you might hear from internal auditors, but it's getting to something that I think is going to be very important to the future of the profession. And the title about Mission Possible will become a little bit more evident as I get into it. But the focus is on making sure that we as internal auditors are recognized as truly being a part of value creation for our organizations. So I'm going to talk about a few things. First of all, we'll get into the mission of internal auditing. Hopefully many of you are aware of that. I'll then talk a little bit about what we call a kind of a rolling internal audit plan that we do at Georgia Pacific, and I've heard others around the world that do this as well, and I'll talk about why I think that's important. Then something that we call a value bet and a value funnel, things that help us make sure that we are continuing to evaluate which projects will best enhance and protect value for our organizations. And then even finish with a scorecard, something that's a little bit different, a little unusual, but I think is a way that we have been able to communicate to our key stakeholders some of the value that we have in fact been able to protect and enhance in our organizations. Now, let me apologize. This is based on an American movie. I'm guessing many of you have not heard of it. It's a movie that comes out near the Christmas holidays called It's a Wonderful Life. And at a point in the movie, an angel comes down from heaven. His name is Clarence. That's the person standing in the picture here. And Clarence tells the main character, who's having a difficult time, has some bad luck in life, that he's been given a great gift. He has the opportunity to see what the world would be like without him. Now, it's a heartwarming story, but why is that relevant to us? Well, I believe it's relevant because we actually have an opportunity and probably a requirement to think about what would life be like without internal auditors. And that's going to be relevant as I move through this presentation, because some of the premise of how we look at value is to say, what if internal audit was not here within Georgia Pacific? What would happen? So that's an important concept to keep in mind. I'll come back a little bit later. Now, when we talk about value, this is the definition of internal auditing. It's been out there since 1999, so fairly old, but still somewhat timeless. And there are the words in there about adding value. And so we've been talking about adding value for almost 20 years in our definition, and probably longer than that. But more recently, last year in 2015, the Global Board approved a new professional practices framework that included a mission for the first time, a mission for internal auditing. Now that mission, the second part of it reads fairly similar to what the definition of internal auditing is about, and that is focusing on doing objective assurance and advisory services, that sort of thing. But the first part was new. That's the part that I underlined on here. And it talks about enhancing and protecting organizational value. So again, that's a new concept. I think most auditors believe that's something we should do, but what does it really mean? And how do we go about doing that? That will be the focus of this presentation, and that's why I titled the presentation Mission Possible, because it is possible, in my mind, to achieve this mission, to go beyond just protecting value to actually enhancing organizational value. Now, when we talk about value, what is that really? Well, this is going to be a very simplistic way of thinking about value. I call this an S-curve of value. And so it starts down at the bottom where somebody in the organization has a good idea. There's a value initiation process where there's an idea or decision that's made that says, I think we can create value for this organization. But at that point, it's not really bringing in extra cash. It's not creating a lot of bottom line impact. It's still just an idea that has to be worked on. Well, as you move up that S-curve, you get to what I call value optimization. Now, this is where you start to figure out how it could be make the product more efficiently, deliver the service more effectively, get it to your customers. Ultimately, that's where value really starts to be created. You can start to create more revenues with less investment and expenses, and that's why you see the curve going up quite a bit. A lot of value is being created. Now, for many types of products and services, you get to a point where the market has caught up and maybe your competitors are coming up with new and different ideas. So there's this concept called creative destruction. And the notion there is that it's better for you to destroy the value in your product and come up with a new product than have your competitors do it. A good example would be Apple. Apple comes out with a new iPhone roughly every 2 years because they're recognizing that the market has changed, the market is expanding, and if they don't come out with a new product, which basically obsoletes the old product, then they will be left behind. So, big deal. What does all that mean? What is the role of internal audit in value creation and value sustainment? Well, here's that same S-curve. And now looking at it a little bit differently, what if a control broke down, a system didn't operate effectively, people who had to make decisions didn't get the right information at the right time? Well, there's a possibility that value could be prematurely destroyed. That's what I've reflected here. I'm not the best PowerPoint artist, so these are all kind of hand-drawn, but I think you get the idea. So that blue area there now is lost value. Value that was destroyed prematurely because something happened in some way that value was not optimized. Maybe your competitors destroyed your product value early. Whatever it is, that's what we're trying to protect. That's the protect organizational value portion of the mission statement. Now, when I talk to I call them customers or my stakeholders at Georgia Pacific, they understand this. That's what they believe auditing is for, to help protect existing value. And that's right. That's a lot that really underpins the assurance that we provide. But if you go back to that mission, there is more to it than that. There's more than just protecting value. There's also enhancing value. So what does that mean? So back to our S-curves. Let's say this is the same S-curve that you saw on the previous page. Well, what if we were able to help in that optimization process so that the company ultimately can create more value? They get to an optimized state quicker and ultimately go further before the creative destruction sets in. As you can see, there'd be more value to the organization. Or there's a possibility that we might be able to help sustain a product or a service, the value, for a longer period of time. Now, how do we do this? Well, we do this sometimes with assurance and many times with advice. That's the consulting service part of the definition of internal auditing. And what we've found at Georgia Pacific is that we've had some success in helping our businesses actually create more value and possibly sustain the value longer term. Now, it's important here to note that this is not value that we are creating. As internal audit, we don't make business decisions about introducing a new product or service, venturing into a new market, making pricing decisions. Those are decisions management makes. We're independent and objective. We don't make those decisions, but we can help management make those decisions perhaps more timely and with more confidence. So in some cases, we're just accelerating the value creation process. Now, this is a quote that I got from something that I think will be out soon. It's an advocacy framework that the global IIA is putting together. And I thought this quote really said a lot about our role in value enhancement. And since I don't read Spanish, I'll have to read off of my own notes here. But internal audit inspires organizational confidence and enables enlightened decision-making. So I think that's a key part of enhancing organizational value. We can help management make enlightened decisions by giving them the confidence that they have the right information, that they have the right control structure, the right people, the sufficient systems to be able to handle those value creation decisions. And I think that's a very inspirational comment right there, is that we really can do more than just protecting value. Our stakeholders are expecting it, and while we don't want to turn our back on the protect value part, I'll talk later in this presentation about how we make sure that we continue to focus on our traditional assurance responsibilities as well. There are opportunities for us to truly enhance organizational value. So this is very small words. I'm going to tell you the important parts of it. It's a framework that we created at Georgia Pacific to help us communicate with our stakeholders. And you'll see two sections encircled. The top center section is really our vision for internal auditing. And you'll notice some of the same words. We say that we protect and drive organizational value or enterprise value. So we switch the terms around. We think protect should be first because that's what we're expected to do. That's our fiduciary responsibility. But we also recognize that we can drive or enhance or enable value creation as well. And this is actually something that we had put together about 5 years ago. So we had started to think along these lines before the IIA did, and I was very happy when the task force created the mission statement that it did, because it aligned very well with what we were already doing. So as I talked to my stakeholders or my customers, and I remember 5 years ago talking to several of them about this, again, they understood that notion of protecting and preserving value. They believe that's why we have internal auditing. But when I talked to them about enabling and enhancing value, they hadn't really thought of that angle, but they appreciated that because of our experience, because of our capabilities and skills, we probably could do some of that. So part of the pursuing this mission for internal auditing is just talking to and educating your customers, your stakeholders, about the dual role that internal auditing can play. Now, in the bottom left, I have another section that's circled, and I'm going to come back to this. But part of what we did is we said it's important to have a way of communicating the type of value, some guidelines into really what value looks like in our organization. And obviously value to a great extent is driven by monetary value, but there are other types of value as well. And what I'm going to show you in a few slides are some guidelines that, again, are too detailed for you to see from the audience, but I'll describe what we're doing. And that was important for us to be able to communicate with our management how we saw value and make sure that they aligned with that as well. So now we're going to get into a little bit about this rolling audit plan approach. Now what we did, we actually started this a couple of years ago, beginning of 2014. And this is something I'd experimented with a bit in a prior company as well. And the notion is that typically an annual audit plan is done, maybe approved by an audit committee or some other governance part of the organization. And then internal audit pursues that plan for the next year until you have a new plan. But the realities are the calendar year is not that magical. Risks change on a regular basis. New risks may emerge. Some risks could heighten in importance. And so we felt it was very important not to focus just on what we thought was important maybe at the end of the previous year, but to be continuously looking at our audit projects and saying, should we still do these? Are these still the most important ones for us to be doing at this time? Now, the other thing that I've seen is that, I use the word anchored, is that once an audit plan is approved, an internal audit function tends to be anchored to that plan, saying we need to complete all of those audits because it's been approved. But as I just said, that's not always going to be where the risks are. The risks may change. And I think the audit committees and management appreciate if we come back and say, we actually think that one of these audits that we had planned to do is now no longer as important as something new that we hadn't planned to do. So it creates good dialogue and shows that we're really thinking in a risk-based manner. Now, the other thing that it requires us to do, though, is that it means we need to have more continuous discussions with our customers, our key stakeholders. And so what we do is we actually, on a quarterly basis, make sure that we are meeting with them to talk about what's going on in their business, what new risks they may be seeing, what new objectives they may have, and we use that to help modify our audit plan. And in fact, what we did is we actually have now gone to this again, quarterly rolling approach where we say we're only going to formally plan and schedule the next quarter. So let's say here we are at the beginning of September. We are a calendar year, fiscal year, so our quarter will end in September. So right now, we are scheduling our projects for the fourth quarter, October, November, and December. Now, we have several other projects that we will plan to do in the future. We have actually more than 12 months worth of projects. But we're formally scheduling a quarter at the time so that we can continue to have these discussions with management to make sure that the future projects make as much sense today as they did 6-9 months ago. Now, the other thing that we did then is we went to something called a funnel, because I found that even though we were only planning a quarter at a time, we still had in our minds ideas of, well, somebody said to do this, so we'll do that in the next first quarter, second quarter, something like that. And I started asking my management team, how are we deciding on a real-time basis what the next important projects are? And so we created this funnel. This is more of a metaphor than anything, but I'll explain it briefly. I refer to the top of the funnel as the hopper. So if you think of an audit universe, these are all the projects that at some point through our risk assessment, through discussions with management, through other monitoring of the risk environment, we said this may make sense for us to do this project coming up. It doesn't formally put it in the plan, it puts it in the hopper for consideration. And then what we need to do is at least once a quarter look at those projects and decide which ones perhaps should come down through the rest of the funnel and be performed as normal audit projects. Now you'll see a dashed line below that top segment, below the hopper. That is where we do something called a value bet. And a value bet is basically us putting together a brief document that says, I'm willing to make a bet that this project is higher priority than other projects. And I'll explain how we do that shortly. So value bets are put together by our individual audit teams. I have to approve each value bet. So therefore, I'm in a position to be able to say, no, I don't think that's as important as you think it is, or I think that might be even more valuable, more important than you're saying. Maybe we should accelerate it more. And the purpose of this is to try and make sure that we are always doing the projects that will protect and enhance as much value as possible for our organization. Now, just because we did a value bet doesn't mean that we're right and that all of our judgments are correct. So as you go down through the funnel, you get to the various stages, planning and we call it discovery sometime, planning a project, the field work, performing a project, wrapping it up and reporting on it. Well, once we get into a project and we start planning it in more detail and maybe even performing the project, we may decide that our original assumptions were wrong. We've learned more about it, we've started to do some testing, whatever, but we then determined that perhaps this isn't going to be as valuable as we originally thought. And if that's the case, then we want to try and wrap up that audit more quickly so we can go on to something else that probably is of higher value. So while most of the thought process goes into the value bet, we do continue to think from a value standpoint about whether we should continue the scope of the audit as originally planned. And then, of course, when you get down into the reporting and follow-up stages, what we're trying to do is report in such a way that puts our audit findings in a context relative to value protection and value creation. So this has also served as a good technique for discussing with management our projects. We can go to them and show them by business. We've got this in SharePoint, so we can filter by business or filter by type of audit, maybe just show the IT audits or the financial audits. And we can talk to management about what's up there in the hopper so they can help us prioritize perhaps when to do a value bet and what to bring down into the rest of the funnel. So again, it's more visual than anything, but it's creating some discipline on our team about getting information from management, doing real-time risk assessment before we just jump in and do an audit project. Now, we've determined that this sort of philosophy works very well at at a project level and even at a finding level. So one of the first things we did is we said, how do we, once we've done an audit and we have findings, how do we evaluate the importance of the value of those individual findings? And this is where we started to really challenge each other on whether we were just putting all findings in an audit report or whether we could really distinguish what I like to call an analogy. The boulders, the big, important, significant findings from the rocks, important but maybe not critical to get done right away, from the pebbles, which are smaller findings. Maybe management should still deal with them, but there's probably no urgency to that. And the idea here, as you can see from the first bullet there, is not all findings are created equal. Some of them will be more significant than others. And so what we wanted to think about in terms, basically, when I would get an audit report draft from one of my audit teams, I would ask the question, why should I care about that finding? Because that's a question they should be able to answer to management if management asked it. And it helped us think through, well, how valuable is this finding? How important is it that it's addressed? It allows us to think about, if they didn't address a finding, is it possible that organizational value would be prematurely destroyed? Or if they didn't address it, is it possible that there's an opportunity out there to create more value that they wouldn't be seeking? So we wanted to think in terms of really business outcomes and say, how likely is it that management's going to care about this finding, that they would think of it as being important? So that was really, it was a good exercise that we went through, and it helped us start to think about the findings, what we found is that it's very easy as auditors, and many of us with a financial background, to default to the financial impact of something. And I would contend in most circumstances, almost everything ultimately has a financial impact, if you think about it far enough. But sometimes the financial impact is very hard to determine and may not be as important as some of the other impacts. For example, the impact on your brand or your reputation. Might that cause the market to start buying fewer of your products or fewer of your services? Another example would be a safety incident. You may receive a fine or penalty for a safety incident, but there's a much higher impact that somebody's been injured, whether it's an employee or a customer or whatever. So it got us thinking outside of just the financial reporting box a little bit, and got us thinking more about what is really the impact to the business. What are the outcomes to the business? Now, one other very important thing that we had to come to grips with and make sure that our management understood was the last bullet on there, is the absence of findings does not mean the absence of value. This is a very important point relative to doing assurance work. If we don't have any significant findings, there is still value in that audit because we provided assurance to management that their controls are operating effectively, that their people are doing what they're supposed to do, the systems are doing what they're supposed to do. So again, that's an important point. We don't want our auditors thinking that if they can't find anything, it's not a valuable audit. If it's the right audit to do, it's still valuable. So again, hold that thought because that's going to come back a little bit when we get to the measurement part. So next thing we decide is that if we could think about audit findings in that context, we could also think about it for a whole project. So I'm kind of building back to that value bet philosophy of how do we decide what projects to do. The previous slide focused on audit findings that we already identified. We've completed an audit. We already know that there are some opportunities for improvement, some control gaps, whatever. And so now at that point, we were just trying to determine how significant they were. But now we're going to back up to the beginning of the audit before we decide to do an audit. We're back at that funnel in the top hopper part. And what we're trying to decide then is what are the types of findings that may occur if we do this audit. And so that requires us to be a little bit prescient or be able to think about the future a little bit, getting back to my It's a Wonderful Life analogy at the beginning. It requires us to say, if we didn't do this audit, what could happen? What value might be prematurely destroyed, or what value opportunities might management miss and not seek, causing perhaps the value curve to be a little bit lower. So that's really the focus on these. And again, we're trying to do something called value bets, which I'll get to shortly. Now, in order to do this, we had to make sure that we were speaking the same language with management. So one member of management may say, I think that's highly significant, highly important. Somebody else may say, no, I think that's only medium. And more importantly, what I wanted to protect against is auditors thinking things are more important than management does. I think all of us auditors tend to be a little bit risk averse. And we tend to think that everything needs to be perfect. But the realities are life doesn't have to be perfect. Risk doesn't have to be completely mitigated. But management is willing to accept some level of risk. So we had to create a dialogue with management on what do you think is of high value so that we could then do our value bets based on that. So that's what this slide is showing. And again, I apologize, the font is quite small, but the intention here is to just show you that what we did is we put together some value categories and determined what was high, medium, and low. And we had discussions with management about this. The numbers on here might not make any sense for your organizations. It'll depend on the nature of your business, the size of your business, etc. But we had heard some people talk about we'd like to see more of the $1 million opportunities. So that's what we set as high, and in talking with management, they said yes, that would be high value to prevent value destruction or to be able to come up with value enhancement opportunities that were over $1 million. And so we set then, medium is 10% of that up to that, so 100,000 to $1 million, and less than 100,000 we said is low value. Now recall that I mentioned before that there are some other types of value that we built into this. You see such things as cash flow, brand or reputation management. There can be integrity or fraud type concerns, being able to grow customers, a variety of different things, even getting into strategic initiatives. So what we try to do when we're pretending we're like Clarence the Ghost, we're trying to say, if we didn't do this audit, which of these types of things might occur in that particular area? And it's usually easiest for us to default to the dollar value, but in fact, again, there could be other possibilities. So with that in mind, and again, we vetted this with our management. We talked to them about it to make sure that they were comfortable, particularly on the low side, because if we see something that we would consider to be low value, if we think that's all the value this project can do, we probably won't do the project. And we needed to make sure they were comfortable with that. Now, there can be other reasons why you might do a low-value project, but to a great extent, our management agreed with us that this framework, these guidelines, were reasonable and would help them be comfortable that we were prioritizing our audit projects in an appropriate manner. So, then what happens from there? That gets to the formal value bet. Now, what we did with the value bet, I've got my notes right here, is we start with a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that based on risk indicators, based on what management is telling us, whatever, we believe that there is a possibility that something could be going wrong. There could be a problem that exists. Or that there's an opportunity that may be able to be sought and harvested that management isn't going for. So, for example, we're a manufacturing company, so I'll give you a manufacturing example. All of our different facilities and plants do cycle counts of inventory. And those cycle counts, they get recorded and they're tracked. And basically, if their accuracy rate is 95% or above, they don't need to do an annual physical count. If it's 90 to 95%, they may have to do more cycle counts to verify the adequacy. And if it's below 90%, they will have to do a physical count. So we can track that as well. And if we see, for example, a particular facility or plant that's running around 89%, and we think they may want to try and get the cycle counts more accurate, there's some inherent risk there that they may start ignoring or changing some of the cycle counts to agree with the books, just so they don't have to do an annual physical. Now, we would call that a risk trigger. So the problem might be that we think there's a possibility that inventory could be misstated because management has not historically been very good at doing their cycle counts, or at least maybe controlling inventory, and that there's a risk that they may be, we use the term fudging, they may be modifying count results just to avoid doing an annual physical. So that would be a hypothesis. The hypothesis could also be, we had a real example of this, that we're having more product damage than we have in the past, and we think our competitors are able to get by with less product damage. So we believe that by us performing an audit, understanding, and in this case it was a data analytics audit, that we would be able to use data to better understand where the damage is occurring and possibly reduce that damage. So again, that was a hypothesis that we made. Now the second thing on our value bet relates to what we call initial value drivers. This is where we go back to those value guidelines from the previous page and say, based on what we know, what's reasonably possible that could occur if we didn't do this audit. So again, let's pretend there's no internal audit. What could happen? And put them in the context of those value guidelines. And then from there, that helps us understand how much value could be at risk here. Is this high, medium, low? And we kind of get to medium high as well because we have so much in the medium category that we'll distinguish between a medium high and maybe a medium low. So we've now done a better job of saying, here's our hypothesis, why we think this audit may be important, and here are some potential value drivers that we think justify doing this audit now. Now, the next thing we have to think about is, what's our investment? How much is it going to cost to do this audit? Our time is valuable. There's an opportunity cost of our auditors doing something that's lower value when they could have been doing something of higher value. So while we don't actually look at it in terms of raw numbers, we do think of it in terms of a return on investment. If we think something could be high value, so $1 million or more of value, and based on our cost of doing audits per hour, let's say we think it'll cost us $50,000 to do the audit, that's a 20 times return on investment, $1 million divided by 50. On the other hand, if we think the potential value is more in the 150,000 range, that may be only a 2 or 3 times return on investment. Now, I tell people that this is more art than science. We're not trying to really calibrate this and say we know this is the amount of value. But it does give us a frame of reference that the amount of time we invest is relevant, and that we want to make sure that we think there's a high enough potential return on investment to justify doing one audit versus another. Again, this is all about prioritization. Now, the last thing we do is there can be some timing and other factors as well. So, for example, if we are helping our external auditors do a year-end audit, well, that has a very specific timeline associated to that. We can't just say, we'll wait and do that second quarter of next year because they'll have already issued the financial statements. So timing considerations can matter. If we're helping with, say, some due diligence in an acquisition or a disposition, again, there's going to be very important timing elements that if we don't do it now, management will have to go outside and get some other resources to do that. So we consider those timing elements. We also consider just other general factors. So, for example, if we have an opportunity to do a project that we think will give very good training to some of our auditors that may then help better prepare them to do higher value projects in the future, we may consider that as well. So again, all of these factors go into this value bet, which helps our individual audit teams decide which projects should we be doing first. Those can come to me, and then I can put these value bets side by side and say, yes, I think this is probably the most important, this is probably next most important. It's a way, again, more art than science, but it's a way for us to try and prioritize what we're doing to make sure that we're using our valuable resources in the best way possible. Now, this is an example, and again, very small, and I've genericized it, but this is an example of what part of a value bet would look like, and then we've added on the bottom, once the project was done, how we evaluated the actual, or assessed the actual value from that project. And so, it's one thing to just say we're going to do a value bet that we think justifies the project and then conduct the project. But like any other project, we need to come back at the end and say, was it really that valuable? Were our assumptions at the beginning borne out by actual value identified or protected during the audit? And so we do come back at the end of each of these and attach a value to the audit. Now again, I'm going to keep repeating this. It's more art than science. So while we put a dollar amount to it, it's a rough ballpark estimate. But what we're trying to do is to be able to evaluate over time whether we're doing the right types of projects and whether we're giving our management a sufficient return on investment. So we created a very simple formula. We kind of refer to that as a total value equation. And it starts with this, starts with the value protected. Now, this is the most difficult number. If you recall before, I said the absence of findings doesn't mean the absence of value. So what we didn't want to do is to say that audit was very clean, we had no findings, therefore it's zero value. But what kind of value do you put on something if there were no findings? Well, we provided assurance that controls are operating effectively, that systems are doing what they're supposed to be doing, etc. So there is value there. And what we decided to do here, we think this is somewhat conservative, but we decided to put a value or attach a value to these projects based on a replacement cost or an outside market value. By that I mean that we said, if we weren't here as internal audit, this project was important enough that you would have outsourced it and had somebody else come in and do that. So we valued it based on the outside cost. In our case, it's about $150 an hour in the Atlanta market, kind of a blend between what we may get from the Big Four. Certain projects we would need them and their expertise. Others that we might need less expertise and go to a cheaper option. So our value protection is just simply saying $150 an hour times the number of hours that we put into it. Now again, we'll talk shortly about how we discuss this with management, but that was the assumption we made. Now the second part of the equation is value realized. Sometimes, we're not necessarily going into audits expecting this, but sometimes you actually may find recoveries. Maybe we were overbilled for something, or we're billed twice and paid it twice. Sometimes we find if we're doing construction or major contract projects that the vendor might have been billing according to the wrong rate sheet, or they might have been duplicating billings to us that we have to pay for. So there can be a variety of things that we consider as part of our value bets, and during an audit we may find that in fact there is realizable or recoverable value. So we add that as a second part of the equation because that's real. That falls to our bottom line. It directly impacts our financial results in a given year. The third area, which is actually the biggest opportunity, we call it value opportunities, is also very difficult to measure. So this is where, based on the work that we did, we believe there's opportunities in the future to perhaps avoid paying more than you need to, or perhaps possibly to find opportunities that otherwise wouldn't have been sought. An example here is, I mentioned that product damage audit that we did. But what we determined is, based on the data that we were able to pull together and analyze and put in a dashboard for management, and they agreed that there was between $20 and $30 million of opportunities to reduce product damage. Now, did we count that for us? No, because we can't make that happen. Management has to make decisions. They will have to invest in trying to reduce the product damage, etc. But we said probably $1 million of that will, at a minimum, be recovered by management in the future. So we just put $1 million in our scorecard for that. This is where, talking to some of our management, they said we're being fairly conservative, but it's still recognizing that we can't make that value be realized. Management has to. So it's a good way to at least create discussion, to create dialogue with management about those opportunities. So all of these together equal total value. Now, we actually then have started to create a nice little graph about total value. And what this is doing is it's now taking those three pieces. The blue bar would be the value protected at the outside replacement cost. The greenish bar would be value realized, so we add that on top of that. And then the yellow bar is the value opportunity, that these are things that we think could be out there. We expect management to get some of that value, but we're not sure how much. Now you see we have three sets of stacked bars here. The middle one is our best guess. That's our estimate applying the criteria I mentioned on the previous slide. The top one says, well, we could be over-conservative, and those estimates could be 25% higher. We don't change the realized because that's actual, but for the protected and an opportunity, those are 25% higher. The bottom side is, okay, maybe we're a little bit overly ambitious, and so we take 25% off of the value protected. We take 50% off of the opportunity. This is, again, where I know our CFO says we're being too conservative, too punitive, but we just want to reflect the fact that these are not necessarily hard savings at this point, but this is how we want to create the dialogue with management about, are we doing the right things? So you'll see a vertical line there. That's our investment in internal auditing. That's how much we spend a year in internal auditing. In our case, it's about $4 million a year. So what this allowed us to do was to go to management, and we could recreate this for each of our business segments. So when we were talking to a business head, it will just show how much they're paying, how much of our costs get allocated to them against the specific value from the projects relating to them. And it created some great dialogue. For example, originally we put the value realized first, and then we had the value protected second. So it was the green, then the blue bar. And one of our business presidents said, no, I think you should put the blue bar first because that's what you're here to do. He agreed with our way of valuing it, and he said, we want to make sure you're always doing that. So if our investment is close to being covered by that, then I'm happy. And more importantly, when we get into some of those yellow areas, they always were asking questions about the green bar. Okay, tell me some of the recoveries you had in my business. Oh, I didn't know that. That's very helpful. Thank you. But when we talked about the yellow bar, that was when they were starting to try and understand, okay, what opportunities have you identified that you're relying on my management to go seek? These business executives wanted to understand that so they could go back to their management and talk about what are you doing around product damage, or what are you doing around making decisions. We actually have products on Amazon.com, and we, again, through data analytics, can analyze product ratings and product comments, so they can ask their management, what are you doing to try and make sure that our product mix is right on Amazon? So again, these numbers, they can get pretty big. It's not like we're getting bonuses on this. This is not a way of specifically evaluating me as the head of audit. This is a way of creating a dialogue with management, and it has been a very healthy dialogue where they can then start talking to us about, are you doing the right projects? Would I like to see you do more of this? We had a meeting with one of our consumer product heads actually it was earlier this week, and he was talking about how he really wants us to focus more on the yellow bar. He thinks there's a lot of opportunity, and he likes the services and the perspective that we bring to it. Now, we had to remind him that we still have a fiduciary responsibility, and we're going to do the blue bar stuff as well. That's still important. But again, it created a very good dialogue where he could start talking about some of the problems they're dealing with, the opportunities that they think they have, and we could talk about how might we be able to help. What sorts of potential projects should we put in the top of that hopper, the top of the funnel, and then what should we be considering when we started to do our value bets? So again, it created some very good discussion, and that's the purpose of this, thinking about value in terms of making sure we're helping to protect organizational value because that's an important part of our mission, but we're also trying to enhance organizational value, which you tend to see more in those yellow bars. Now, there are some other things that we put on our scorecard as well, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but in the top left, that circle, that dial, if you will, this is where we kind of check ourselves and make sure that we're not swinging the pendulum too far towards the consulting and advisory services. That tends to be where a lot of the opportunities are, but we're always reminded of the fact that our audit charter still focuses on providing assurance, making sure we're protecting existing value. So we've agreed with management that we think the protect side or the assurance side should typically be between 50 and 80% of our hours, and that means then the opportunity enhanced side would be somewhere between 20 and 50%. So we looked at this, and so far in 2016, we're running pretty similar to that. We're a little under 2/3 of our time are still protect value, still assurance in nature, and about 1/3 of our time is more the advisory, consulting, and enhanced value. So again, this is just a way that we can monitor ourselves and we can communicate to management that we're not moving too far into the opportunity side, because then that may mean that we are missing appropriate possibilities of determining whether value is being prematurely destroyed. Now, in the upper right, I won't spend much time on this, but one of the other things that we do as an audit function, a part of our vision, is to be a pipeline of talent to the organization. That means that we try to find people either inside the company or from the outside to bring in the audit, give them some training, and after maybe 2, 3, 4 years, then find another place for them in the company. So what that's doing is it's just, kind of monitoring over the last 12 months, how successful have we been at that? How often have we been able to hire people from inside the company to bring them into audit? How often have we been able to move them out? And we have this program called Visiting Auditors and Guest Auditors. Guest auditor is not a new concept, but that's where we may get somebody from the business and have them participate with us on an audit so they can learn more about how we think about risk and control. They can maybe get to see one of our facilities that helps them be a better business person. And perhaps in the future, then they might be somebody who comes in the audit. Visiting auditor is the opposite, where we send one of our auditors. It'll have to be a more experienced auditor to maybe participate in a business activity for a while, a particular project or something like that. It gives them good business experience, which will make them a more effective auditor. And in some cases, then they end up getting hired by that business, which again is part of our vision. Obviously, they can't come back to audit and then go and audit that part of the business because their objectivity is impaired, for a period of time. But again, these are ways that we're trying to view ourselves as, again, a pipeline of talent for the organization, and that is another way that we can bring value. Now, the bottom right, something that we as auditors run into, and I suspect you're the same. Sometimes we do actually find accounting adjustments. And originally we had that as a fourth bar on that bar chart on the previous page. But what we realized is whenever we found an accounting adjustment, it was always negative. It was reducing earnings. You have failed to value your inventory properly, or we had some situations where depreciation was inappropriately applied. Whatever. There's a variety of adjustments that we find periodically. So what we decided to do is that business heads don't view that as value. Our CFO and controller, they view it as value. So we just put that on a separate chart. It's still important to talk about, but it's not something that we wanted to kind of use to chalk up value on our scorecard overall. So again, what we're trying to do here is just create a visual representation that helps promote dialogue with management about what we're doing, how we believe we're protecting and enhancing value, and what sort of things that maybe we should do more of or less of. As I say, it's all about the dialogue with management. So, kind of in closing here, I believe it is possible to measure the value of audits. Now, I put the word measure in quotes because it's not always going to be a very precise measurement. But there is a way, and you may find different ways in your organization, but there are ways to assign values to every audit project, and we shouldn't be afraid to do that because it helps us learn more about the projects we're doing, were those really worthwhile projects or not, and helps create that dialogue with management. And secondly, that's really the key purpose here. This is, as I say, it's not about incentive compensation or not about patting ourselves on the back for a job well done. It's about being able to communicate in the organization the value of internal audit, that we return much more value, whether it's protected or enhanced, than their investment in internal auditing. And that's good. It's not like we're trying to avoid being outsourced. We're just trying to communicate that we are valuable and we want management to help us make sure that we can continue to be more valuable in the future. And then kind of that last one there, I'm going to have to read that. Oh, yes. It's important to try and build this into your audit charter to the extent that you can. These are things, now I will admit, we are a privately held company, so we're not subject to our some of the regulations that listed companies are. We have a little bit of a looser governance structure, so it was probably easier for me to do all of this than it might have been. I previously worked for publicly held companies where you had to report to a more formal audit committee and things like that. But I believe this is the type of dialogue that can and should be held with executive management and the board or audit committee. That what people tell me is, no, my audit committee is very conservative. They just want us to focus on the value protection stuff. And while I recognize that's important to them, those audit committee members are also board members. And as a board member, they want to see the company grow and be successful. So they actually are interested in some of the value opportunities. And so the key here is having that discussion with them and having that discussion with management to be able to say, where should that dial be? How much of our time do you really want us spending solely on assurance and protection type work versus maybe on some advisory and consulting type work? Because again, we do have the skill sets, we do have the purview and the ability to look across the organization, that if you want us to do 100% assurance, we're not helping the organization be as successful as it really could be. And in my sense, in talking to people in public companies and from my days in a public company, I think this can work. Now, if you work for, say, a public sector company, a governmental organization, a not-for-profit, you may have to change that dialogue a little bit. But the point here is that every function in an organization needs to be able to articulate their value, articulate their worth. And I think you can use some of these ideas in your own context to be able to drive that conversation with your executives and with your governing board. So with that, I'd be happy to open it up for questions. I think I've taken most of my time, but I do have a little bit of time for questions. And since I don't speak Spanish, I will probably have to put on the translation headphones. So does anybody in the audience have any particular questions on this topic? Well, if not right now, I'd be happy to entertain any questions at break. Again, you may need to have a translator if you don't speak English, but thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and have a very good day.